Next on the tools to talk about for documentation is the grid tool. So over here in the toolbox we have this grid elements tool. We'll just go to the favorites for this. There's really only one. The important thing here is that obviously it's on the correct layer. This layer is locked by default, so let me go into the layer combinations and AG grids. We will unlock that layer here. That will allow me to put this on that layer and edit the layer. So with the favorites, there's not much to it. It's really just sort of geometry and appearance, and then there are automatic naming of grids, but the reality is, like, there's so few grids in an average residential project. Even some of our larger projects, it's just easier to have a grid custom name, and then all you do is draw it in. It's essentially like drawing in a line. That can then be adjusted with the various pink hotspots that show up on that grid. So I can actually offset left and right. This is useful if you had a grid that was really close to another grid. So for example, we have a bearing line there and maybe center line of the post here, they overlap. This allows me to then offset that grid over. So I could say that this is, let's see here. So we would typically only put these grids at the bearing lines. On this particular project that I'm sort of mocking up here as the example, it was mostly at these porches. We didn't actually put grids at the walls. We only referenced those walls dimensioned from the grids. But if we did have grid lines that were offset like this, we do have options for that. The grid line doesn't need to show on both sides of the floor plan. You can turn off here in the floor plan settings the grid line for one end and only show it at the other end. There are also options in the elevation settings. So if I look at this elevation marker here, for example, let's come in here, and then there's this grid tool settings right here. This allows you to show the grid elements of selected stories or selected names. So that if I did have a grid that was only shown on one side or the other, it would show here. You know, as an example, if this was grid line B, and then in the elevation marker settings, that grid line can be excluded. So only show grid line A, for example. There's also this option, go ahead and say all again, for auto stagger markers if they overlap. This applies to the grid tool in the elevation marker. Again, I'm on the elevation marker settings when I'm looking at this. So what this means is that, let me go pull this all the way across so we can see all these grids. And I'll go ahead and copy this down so we can see that from the other side. So here's what would be the south elevation, here's what would be the north elevation. Let's look at those together. So we'll open that with current view settings, all. That's going to pull these up here. So you can see that grid line B is to the left of this elevation, and flip over to this elevation, or wherever that would be showing. There we go. And then it shows to the right. So it's automatically offset here. I can adjust the height of that stagger here, but any other settings, if I were to, for example, push this over to here to get that leg to show, when the elevation's rebuilt or redrawn, it actually snaps back to where it was at. That's the auto stagger. But what that prevents is it flipping from one side, overlapping the other grid on the opposite elevation. So that auto stagger in the elevation section marker settings is really critical in order to get that to show up correctly and not lapping over the other side with a manual offset in the elevation settings. Other than showing on elevation and sections and floor plans, there's not much to the grid tool. If you need the grid to show up as part of your IFC model, you will need to turn the grid display in 3D on. In the favorites, that's typically not shown. You can also limit which stories the grids show on. I've yet to see an example of where that might be necessary. If you didn't need to show it on your roof plan, for example, you can hide it by layer. You don't necessarily need to exclude it by stories. So that's sort of one of those cases of multiple ways to manage the model, but the simplest is usually the best.